the Jurassic through the Cenozoic, you see the number of, well, in this case, genera almost doubles. And people often think of marine communities as becoming much more diverse through the Mesozoic and into the Cenozoic. That probably is true that they did become more diverse, but by how much is something that's being argued about at the moment. And I would contend that this process of lithification has a significant bias on this particular pattern. So what I did is split these collections up into the different lithifications, the sievable, nice material that's in red, and the slabs, like I showed you pictures of before, in black. And you can see the very clear difference in the Cenozoic in the diversity of one sample to another. So that's an example of some science that I'm doing at the moment. I'm also interested in how this process of turning nice seashells, as these ones on the right, these are from unlithified sediments, how the process of turning them into lithified slabs of rock affects one's ability to describe them, how it might influence a systematist, someone who describes species. And I just show you an example of 4 different families on the slide, and I've also got another slide. Each family has a row, I didn't run to labeling them, but you can see that they are preserved in different ways. Casts and molds on the left-hand side, shells on the right-hand side. Here's some more examples. These are all fossils. And going from nice fresh specimens on the right to the left, deeper in the fossil record, you lose many of the characteristics you might need to describe them. So for example, in clams, the hinge is very important to adequately describing a genus or a species. Also important is the distribution, the shape and size of the muscle scars on the inside of the clam. These are things that you can't see necessarily in many older rocks, more lithified rocks. And again, I show some results of my work on this, where I try and identify important characters, important features on different species of clams and snails that should be there if they're well preserved. And as you see in each of these graphs, going from the Cambrian to the Cenozoic, there is an increase in the proportion of these preserved characters. And likewise, each of them correlates with an increase in the amount of material that's unlithified, nicely preserved. And that's another way of looking at it. If we forget about time and just look at lithification, the less lithified, the more unconsolidated the materials that these specimens come from, the more of these key features or characters you can actually recognize. Okay, and that's as far as I got for this talk here. I ran out of time with all my flight delays today, but it's an example of 2 projects I'm working on as a postdoc up at Yale, and the nature of the work that I do there. I had one more thing I wanted to say. I did bring some books by Dredgers just to show some of the work that he does, and some of the interactions we may have in the future will be dealing specifically with soft-bodied organisms. And actually I see one of them, Fossils of Burgess Shale, is up on the back row there for your silent auction, so I needed to have brought that book. I also brought another book, which I don't know if Rich has talked about yet, by Richard Forty. It's called Dry Storeroom No. 1, and he's just released it. It's a history, a social history of the British Museum of Natural History. It's full of fun anecdotes. So I haven't actually had a chance to read it yet. I bought it 2 weeks ago, and my girlfriend hasn't given it back since. And she's not a biologist or a geologist, so it's fun reading. So I welcome you to have a look at that. And I've also got Makero's fossil ecology book here as well, which I think is well worth clicking through. So thank you very much for having me again, and I welcome any questions.
terminology, not being a geologist or anything like that, you suggest that lithification creates a bias. In other words, we know less about what may be huge numbers and varieties of fossils that are kind of in stone.
Yeah.
Are there any new technologies that can do, like various forms of, I guess, seismography or within the field of seismology?
Yeah, it's a little annoying in that I present this problem, but don't necessarily offer a solution around it, other than pointing out to folks studying biodiversity that comparisons between the deep fossil record, the Paleozoic fossil record, and the present day should be done with extreme caution because of this preservational bias. So that's really the outcome of this work is just to say, hey, be careful about making any comparisons in biodiversity or ecology because you're missing a lot of the story. But there are time intervals in which fossils are preserved even though they're on lithified rock in such a way that they can be extracted. And I flew past this slide because I didn't want to start talking about it. But these are silicified Cambrian, phosphatized Cambrian shells. They're encased in very hard rock, but if you dissolve that rock, you can leave a residue of very fine, small shells. Now, we don't have preservation like this throughout the Phanerozoic, throughout the last 500 million years. It's only in certain time intervals because of the seawater geochemistry that we see this. Another example are the silicified fossils. There's an abundance of those during the Permian. So the Permian of West Texas is famous for its silicified brachiopods, which I know the brachiopods of the Coke Formation are spectacular, but they really blow them away in terms of the details that you can see, including internal structures. So that's something I'm very interested in, is why we see these changes through time and preservation, and how that might affect our understanding of biodiversity.
In the illustration you showed early in the talk about the book that you loved, with the slices of how it looked, and you said it showed as time went forward, like there's a lot more going on here. You said it sort of, but that early picture with less going on, of course, didn't have any soft-bodied creatures.
Yes.
So it might be a completely biased.
Absolutely. And I wanted to talk about this tonight, because this is the crazy part of my postdoc research. I want to know more about the things that aren't there. And getting at that is very difficult. There's a couple things you can do, and unfortunately I'm running out of time to put the slides in. But we know from isolated, exceptional preservation of fossils that certain groups existed. So for example, back in the Cambrian and the Burgess Shale, we see a lot of early examples of organisms that we have at the present time. The earliest worms, the earliest mollusks of the present time. And we don't necessarily see those in the rest of the record. So for example, the fossil record of worms is very patchy. Burgess Shale has some exquisite ones. So we know they existed because of exceptional preservation like that. We also know from molecular techniques that certain groups diverged at a certain time in Earth's history. You can estimate from their differentiation in genetics that they may have diverged at a certain number of million years ago. So we know that they might have been present from that. And we also have evidence such as trace fossils now. I brought this wonderful book by Adolf Seilaker along as well as an example of trace fossil evidence.
I had one other kind of thing I wondered about is like, how does biodiversity correlate with like perhaps the sheer mass of biological material in any one environment at any given time? Like, is biodiversity a response to a challenge in the environment to try different ways to adapt, or is it that it's just so good that everybody thrives? and you just have piles of biomatter just building up everywhere, everybody's vying, you know.
Yeah, so I mean, that's where this is all leading, really, is what does, if we can ever get at a realistic pattern, a real pattern that's not biased, what does it really mean? Is it primarily a function of evolution? Evolutionary processes lead to new organisms, different organisms. So is that the primary control on a biodiversity curve that's going up?